Okay, ice in the Arctic. We've all seen the scary pictures of melting ice and forlorn polar bears. And this report certainly is scary. It says that the Arctic Ocean is warming, icebergs are growing scarcer in some places, and the seals are finding the water too hot. Reports all point to a radical change in climate conditions and hitherto unheard of temperatures in the Arctic zone. Expeditions report that scarcely any ice has been met with as far north as 81 degrees 29 minutes. Great masses of ice have been replaced by moraines of earth and stones, while at many points well-known glaciers have entirely disappeared. And this is right from the U.S. Weather Bureau in 1922. Again with sea ice, we are stuck with satellite imagery, and therefore we are limited to the last 30 years, so our perspective is very narrow. But anecdotal evidence from ships seems to point to the fact that the Arctic was at least as warm in the 1930s, as evidenced by the previous report, but we don't have good observation evidence to prove it, though this ice core data from Greenland seems to indicate temperatures at least as warm as today at mid-century. In 2007, in October, our local newspaper, the Arizona Republic, proclaimed in a headline that the Arctic sea ice was at an all-time low. All-time, of course, in the Republic's eyes, apparently being 30 years, which is as long as we've been able to measure sea ice from satellites. Interestingly, though, on the exact same day, on the other side of the world, the Antarctic sea ice hit a 30-year high. You saw that reported too, right? Yeah, neither did I. By the way, if you're worried about sea levels, the sea ice we're talking about in the Arctic and Antarctic is actually irrelevant. Just like melting ice in your glass of water, melting sea ice has no real effect on sea levels. It's melting land ice that affects sea levels, and 90% of that ice is in Antarctica, about 8% in Greenland, and the rest in miscellaneous other glaciers. So let's talk about glaciers. I told you back when we were discussing the Little Ice Age that we would come back to these glaciers. The increasing or decreasing size of glaciers is something that's actually more easily tracked by older technologies than the sea ice extent. So we have a longer data history on glacier lengths. We have geographers' measurements and maps of glaciers going back hundreds of years in some cases. We can see from this data that glaciers were growing through the 1700s, corresponding to the Little Ice Age. After the Little Ice Age ended in the early 19th century, glaciers began to retreat, and they retreated steadily all the way from the early 1800s to today, though as this chart shows, the glacial retreat has perhaps slowed down in the last 50 years. To believe that the current retreat of glaciers is due mainly to man-made global warming, you have to believe that somewhere right here, say around 1950, some natural process that had been causing glaciers to melt over 100 years just halted. The natural process halted, and at the exact same time, man-made CO2 took over and kept glaciers retreating at the exact same pace. Or you could just apply Occam's razor and say that the entire 150-year trend has nothing to do with man and is a natural result of the recovery from the Little Ice Age. Here are two specific examples among the hundreds that underlie the trend I just showed you. On the left is a map of glaciers at Glacier Bay, Alaska. I've been up there and it's beautiful. This is where the front of the glacier was in 1794. This is where it was in 1860, and somewhere around that time we started burning a little bit of coal in London. Here it is in 1907, where we've added a little bit of CO2 in the atmosphere. So all of this preceding retreat happened by 1907, which was before most of the CO2 was put in the air. This is what happened between 1907 and today. A second example is shown on the right. Here's a famous glacier in Greenland that's often used as a case study because it has receded a fair amount over the last couple years. But it started receding way back in 1851, a time well before any substantial fossil fuel combustion. Again, glacier retreats are not a new phenomenon in the last 50 years, i.e. the man-made CO2 era. Glaciers have been retreating steadily for 150 to 200 years for reasons totally unrelated to man's burning of fossil fuels. So the retreat of glaciers correlates much better with the end of the Little Ice Age than it does with the beginning of serious fossil fuel consumption. And you can see the same thing with sea level. Sea level goes up for two reasons. One is melting ice, though that is not likely the most important factor. Probably more important to rising sea levels is the thermal expansion of water. When mercury gets warmer, it goes up in the thermometer. When water gets warmer, sea levels rise. By the way, according to the IPCC, all the fuss about Greenland melting is largely irrelevant. Ice melting in Greenland is projected to be largely offset by increased ice in Antarctica. It is the thermal expansion of oceans, not melting glaciers, that drives the IPCC sea level forecasts. Some of the data we have is suspect because it is from tide gauges where the land may be rising or falling and thus disturbing sea level measurement. But the data we have says that since the Little Ice Age, we have had nearly constant rate of sea level rise for 150 years. So the answer to the large extent as to why sea levels are rising 2 to 3 millimeters a year is not man-made CO2, but because sea levels have been rising at this pace for 150 years. We can see the rate of rise plotted on the left. Again, we see cyclical variations, interestingly enough, on about the same 11-year cycle as sunspots, but no real rising trend. If you saw Al Gore's movie, he said sea levels would rise 20 feet, and implied this could well occur in the next 100 years. The IPCC is a bit more grounded, arguing that sea level rise will likely be closer to 12 to 18 inches over the next century, or about 3 millimeters a year, hardly different from the pace we have measured over the last century.